You would also think that with the amount of time that Mr. Champagne has spent as an elected official, you'd think that he would know better by now, wouldn't you?
If he needs to look any further for conflict of interest, you could perhaps look at his boss as well.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everybody. So today we're going to be joined by a real strong, real conservative member of Parliament. And this is someone that we've seen many times in the House, many times in committee. Most recently, we followed his committee for about 16 hours and 2 days, something like that, when the Conservatives were fighting tooth and nail on Bill C9 and trying to protect religious freedoms in this country. So to talk about that, as well as maybe one other issue that's in the news today, Philip Lawrence, Member of Parliament for Northumberland Clark. Phil, welcome back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the time. And thank you to all your great viewers tuning in there. Remember, like and subscribe.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. Okay, so let's just talk about C9 for a minute. It started as a bill to under the guise of trying to protect religious freedom in this country. Throughout committee, it morphed into something else. For those that may not understand exactly what's going on with Bill C9 and what's in it, can you give our viewers just a quick summary?
Yeah, and so there are a series of provisions there that some of the objectives are laudable, such as the protecting of religious organizations. But as often happens, the unintended consequences are will have much graver effects than any positive benefits that will come from this legislation. And I'll take you back actually to there's very few moments, like there's lots of times in Parliament when I'm surprised or shocked, but there are very few times when I've actually felt like a physical chill come down my spine. And that actually happened in Justice Committee when Mark Miller, as a chair, for those of you who aren't aware, it's actually fairly rare for a chair to make an intervention. Usually it's something maybe personal or otherwise that they really feel is important. And so they sort of break protocol and they take the floor. They have the ability to do that, but it's a power they rarely use. And I happen to be sitting around the table when Mark Miller, as chair, made an intervention that was absolutely chilling to my core, of which he denied the ability or the willingness or the acceptability really of the religious exemption. And so in Canada's hate speech, of course, hate speech is illegal in Canada right now before C9, which really, why are we putting C9 in place anyways? It's already illegal. But there is a good faith religious exemption, meaning that if a pastor, if an imam, if a rabbi goes in front of their congregation and reads from the Bible, the Torah, or the Quran, and they do it in good faith, that they are immune from any type of prosecution from the hate laws. And Mark Miller took the opportunity to say, well, no, that's not how it should be. That people should be prosecuted if they read certain provisions of the Torah, of the Quran, of the Bible. I never thought, having lived my life here in Canada, that I would ever see an elected official saying that a holy person should face criminal prosecution for merely reading their holy book. And the idea of my pastor reading a particular part of the Bible and facing a criminal sanctions for that it should scare us all. And you know what? It's not just folks who are on the right side of the equation, like myself, proudly conservative, but it's people who are very much on the left side. So folks who have voted against this include Elizabeth May, not exactly your right-wing zealot. And she did it based on the civil liberties, which is the same thing. We need to have free speech, and we need to actually be able to offend each other in order to have the best possible dialogue for the country. So I guess my concluding comments is that C9 was an unnecessary piece of legislation, and then when added to the amendment, the block amendment, to remove the religious exemption, creates an undue, unnecessary burden on Canadians, and potentially criminalizes reading aloud the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah.
And the Conservative Party spared no time in terms of the fight against this. It was a parade of MP after MP that just kept coming into the Justice Committee on these days. And we produced a video called 8 Hours of Injustice, and we followed that, and it was its own mini Netflix special because of all of the crazy comments, non-comments by the Liberals. They wouldn't even talk about why they would or would not vote for that amendment when it came to the block. And then it subsequently made it through committee and made it through the House after the Liberals shut down debate on that. And they wouldn't allow any witnesses to come and speak on the new amendment in removing that religious freedom, did they?
No, they programmed it. Meaning when you program it, they limited debate. And so it's the irony of ironies, I suppose, that they censored a bill to increase censorship so they limited the amount of debate, or they, quite frankly, as I said, they censored the debate to limit the amount of conversation, because there are pieces of legislation that the government are aware, and this is one of them, that the more there's debate, the more there is awareness of this issue, the less popular the legislation will be. And so in order to get that legislation through before there was even more of upset and upheaval, they limited the amount of debate so they could get it to the Senate as quickly as possible. And we fought hard. I'm so proud of my colleagues like Andrew Lawton, Jamil Javani, Larry Brock. They all were. They spent hours after hours. And anyone who's had the opportunity or the privilege to filibuster to fight for what you believe, I've gladly done it. I've done it for hours to prevent bad legislation from affecting Canadians. It's not an easy thing. For every 5 minutes that you're seeing in front of committee, there's usually a couple hours, if not more. And so you can imagine, if you're speaking for hours and hours, the amount of not only the time that you're on stage, but also all the preparation, all the staff working hours on end to fight this tooth and nail. At the end of the day, we lost this battle, but I have 110% belief that we will win the war.
And let's just say a shout out based on your comments. Shout out to all the staffers behind all of the members of Parliament at all of these committee meetings and all of the other engagements that the MPs are involved with, because they're the unsung heroes behind our democracy, making sure that MPs have the documents. They do hours and hours of research behind the scenes and help prepare for what you actually see on camera. So shout out to the staffers. Now, the fight, thankfully, isn't over yet, because the bill is now in the Senate, and the Senate has not passed this yet. We're in an interesting scenario regarding the Senate right now, because the school of thought before was that there was all these senators that were beholden to Justin Trudeau because he appointed them all, but Justin Trudeau's not around anymore, and it seems like the Senate is not as beholden to the Liberal Party that necessarily put them there. So what is your take on how this might go in the Senate, and should Canadians keep writing letters and contact their senators in order to make their voices known?
It's difficult to predict. So the tradition of the Senate would be to defer to the elected representatives, but this is an important piece of legislation that we need to push against. And so I would encourage everyone to take every opportunity they can, even if the odds are against us. I'm one who believes in miracles, and so let's fight with tooth and nail. Let's call senators. Let's write senators. Let's email senators. And like I said, I believe in miracles, so we never know what can happen, right?
So for those interested in contacting your senator, check out the description of this video right at the top. We have a link there where you can look up the senators in Canada and where you can find which senator is actually representing your region. But you don't have to limit it to your region. You can contact any senator that you like. So we encourage Canadians to keep up the fight in order for us to try to stop or even limit what is going on with this horrendous bill. Now, speaking about horrendous, let's talk about this horrendous high-speed rail boondoggle that is currently in the media right now. It's pretty crazy. $90 billion is the budgeted amount, and my rule of thumb is whatever the government says they're going to spend, double it. And they want this done within somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 odd years, the whole line. What's your take on this Alto high-speed rail project? Do we even need it right now, considering what Canadians are going through?
Yeah. So, and life is a series of trade-offs, right? They're decision points we make. And so, would I like to get from Toronto and Montreal via rail in 2 hours? Sure. That's appealing. There's no doubt about that. But like everything else in life, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And when you start breaking down the cost, it becomes immediately clear that this is not worth the perceived benefits. The costs, like $90 billion. I mean, I think you're even being generous there that it comes in for $180 billion. My money would be north of $200 billion by the time everything was completed. It's just some of the costs. There's the $200 billion, or sorry, $90 billion, they say, which equals about $8,000 per family across from coast to coast. So there's an equity issue, right? Like, why should a family of four in British Columbia have to support the transit from Toronto to Montreal when they may never ride it, and their family may have to pay $8,000. There's property rights issues as well, and so in the last Budget Implementation Act, the government put in a number of expropriation provisions which allowed them to make it easier to expropriate, and that means that you'll have along Eastern Ontario and in Quebec. Families that have had farms for generations, that the government will have the ability, without their consent, for fair market value, without their consent, to take their property. In addition to this, one of the main arguments is convenience for people getting from Ottawa to Toronto or Toronto to Montreal. But it'll also create tremendous inconvenience in Eastern Ontario and in Quebec, because a way that high-speed rail works is there aren't overland crossings. So you either have to go under the train or above the train, which costs tens of millions, if not more, which means there'll be relatively few crossings. So if you happen to live north or south of that tracks, and your school, your workplace, your church, or even perhaps more scary, your hospital is on the other side of that tracks, it could cost you half an hour on your daily commute if you're going to work or if you're trying to get to a hospital. Just imagine an ambulance coming to try and get you and getting on both sides of that track. It could be an hour or more. And the way it works for those folks who maybe aren't as familiar with Eastern Ontario, a lot of our infrastructure is in the south, and the tracks will be in the north, which means you're effectively cutting off people who happen to live an hour north of Lake Ontario, which will create tremendous inconvenience for the people in Eastern Ontario. So in sum, yeah, the idea of high-speed rail, the idea of more infrastructure, that's great. But when you look at the cost, it tremendously outweighs it. And I'm suspecting you might also ask me, Ryan, some questions about some of the people who were involved in this project as well, and I eagerly wait to respond to those as well.
Have you been sneaking a peek at my questions here, Mr. Lawrence? Well, before we get to that, it's a, you share the sentiment that I do. Do we need high-speed rail? Sure, absolutely, we need it. But where is it on the priority list right now of this country? I think it's way down further on the priority list. It's like, would I like a gold toilet seat in my bathroom? Sure, that would be kind of neat. But that priority is way down on my list. I don't think I would ever buy it in my lifetime. So, to the point, people from across the country are going to be spending money on a on a rail line that they don't even have a choice whether they spend the money on it because they're going to be taxed and they're going to have to pay for it at some point. Does it make more sense to actually take that money and invest it in infrastructure like pipelines and opening the Ring of Fire and creating wealth, creating jobs, and creating, infrastructure for Canada to survive based on getting our resources out of the ground so that we can afford high-speed rail later on? Or does it make sense to ignore all of that and just spend all the money now? I think we know what the answer is.
Yeah, and so actually that gives me an opportunity to respond to some of the arguments. Or this is one of I think the weakest arguments in favor of the high-speed rail that people will bring forward. They'll say to us as conservatives, "We thought you guys were for big projects. You guys are for pipelines." Well, the obvious response is that pipelines, the Ring of Fire, as you mentioned, they will add to our GDP. They will create revenue for the government. The government. I guess to their credit, have come out and said that $90 billion, or as we said, might balloon up to double that, might be $200 billion, will never, ever be recovered by fares. The whole reason why you build a pipeline is so that the government is a net winner in terms of revenue, right? Even TMX, which the government will woefully overspend on, they will get that. We will get that money back as taxpayers. The government also has been out front. They've said up front, you will never get that money back. That $1 million will never, and that 90 billion will never, ever be recovered. And in fact, a recent study at McGill said, in addition to that $90 billion and the interest on that, because every dollar that we spend, we pay interest on as Canadian taxpayers, we will also have an ongoing loss. They project it somewhere around $2 billion every year it operates. And so this will be a money loser, right? Unlike a pipeline or a Ring of Fire that will create revenue, like as you said, that will allow us to support our social safety network, right? As our deficit and our debt get bigger and bigger and bigger, we put in danger some of the many social programs that Canadians value. And this, by adding another $90 billion on the debt, will continue to endanger those programs. We need to grow Canada's economy. Of course, we want to have all Canadians have prosperity, but even for those who are challenging or who are given a short end of the stick at the beginning of their life and may have economic challenges, who rely on those social programs, they need us not to waste the money, but for us to grow our economy so that we can reinforce the social safety net, not allow it to atrophy.
Now, speaking of the Ring of Fire, there's a Ring of Fire that has seemed to surround Mark Carney's finance minister, Francois-Philippe Champagne, when it relates to this project. So, although the money was talked about in March of last year, his wife ended up joining the company in August of last year, and then you have the budget that occurs. And now we're hearing there's a conflict of interest because of his wife working there. And all of these kind of cards are not really lining up. And Mr. Champagne is having a difficult time explaining certain aspects of this. Can you walk Canadians through this?
Yeah. So according to, it's Philip Francois Champagne. He's our Minister of Finance. His wife, as you pointed out, joined the Alto Corporation as the Vice President of Environment. According to the minister, he disclosed that to the Ethics Commissioner. The challenge is the Ethics Commissioner has no evidence of this, and has said that to their knowledge, they were not contacted. And so Mr. Champagne has some questions to ask there. In addition to that, he did not publicly disclose that he had a conflict. And so one would think on a major issue like this, not only would you disclose it to the ethics commissioner, by the way, it's we as politicians, as MPs, we have to do a disclosure every year. And so I have to give all my assets and any business I'm involved in and disclose it. It wasn't included on that. I have to give my wife's occupation as well on that. And so according to what I've seen in media reports, none of that was disclosed. There was no public disclosure, as I said, either. And then there were a number of votes. Of course, the Budget Implementation Act had, as we talked about earlier, had provisions in it that directly affected Alto, the Expropriation Act. But there was also a vote directly on removing those provisions and putting them back into the budget, which he voted on. And so when you recuse yourself on, of course, you should recuse yourself of any discussions, like if he's talking to the Prime Minister or the Minister of Transportation. But perhaps the most important part of recusing yourself is not voting on the issues of which you have a conflict of interest. And he clearly did that. And so I think he has a lot of questions to answer. And I look forward to him coming to committee and having perhaps Mr. Barrett or some of my great colleagues ask him some questions about this.
Now, just on the issue itself, this may get kind of lost in the story, but for the benefit of Canadians, can you explain to them why this is a conflict of interest?
Right. Thank you. Sometimes you get so knee deep in these things, you forget to sort of widen out the lens, right? And so because Mr. Champagne's wife is the Minister of Environment, Minister of Environment, the Vice President of Environment. She stands to economically benefit, presumably, if Alto does well and if Alto finishes their project of building the high-speed rail. Meaning if they make money, she'll at least retain her employment and perhaps there'll be bonuses and other economic advantages. And so when he is voting in favor or in furtherance of Alto, he is in effect voting for the economic gain of his wife. That is an obvious conflict of interest. And while Prime Minister Carney is correct that many MPs have spouses and many of those spouses have occupations, if in fact there is a direct conflict, meaning that a vote will directly improve your own economic or at least your spouse's economic situation, you need to declare that conflict and you need to recuse yourself, most importantly, from voting.
Yeah, and it's not that the problem is actually that Alto is given this contract, and that's where Canadians need that clarity here, because Alto is a crown corporation. It's expected to get government money. That's fine. The issue is of private interest, which is what you're talking about, in that Francois Philippe Champagne's spouse stands to benefit privately from these investments, and this is where he should have just stayed out of it, not voted for it, stayed away from any announcements about it, and that way he can confidently say, listen, I've had no influence on this whatsoever. This was the will of the government. It wasn't will of myself. But the other aspect to this is because she is his wife, presumably they share their money in some case. So he's also benefiting himself indirectly by supporting that, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and that's 100% and a great description of what a conflict of interest is and how it can be avoided. I mean, there are, to a certain extent, every vote that every MP votes on could have a public interest benefit, meaning that if I vote to reduce taxes, I'm reducing my taxes, I'm reducing and I'm growing the economy, which benefits everyone, including myself. But when you have a particular issue, a specific issue like Alto, that could be the gain of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even more, that will affect your family specifically, that has to be disclosed. And I would say, arguably, that the Minister of Finance, who, other than the Prime Minister, has probably the most control over the spending of money, taxpayers' money, has a higher bar to hit. Which means you should do more than just the bare minimum. If there's any chance of you having a conflict of interest or gaining personally from a public vote, not only should you disclose it, in my opinion, you should be out there and saying, here's the deal. Here's how what they call a firewall, which means as if in fact you do stand to gain privately, you make sure these are all the processes we're putting in place, procedures to prevent myself having any decision or any influence on myself on a decision that could gain me finances privately.
Well, you would also think that with the amount of time that Mr. Champagne has spent as an elected official, the amount of time he spent in a government that has gone through multiple embarrassing ethics violations that have been made public, all the scandals, all the investigations. You'd think that he would know better by now, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly had a long history, including he was the Minister of Industry, of course, when the Green Slush Fund broke. And you know, if he needs to look any further for conflict of interest, you could perhaps look at his boss as well. I'll allow other commentators to talk about how Brookfield had potentially could benefit from some of the decisions coming forward. But I would think having a former board member of Brookfield there of a massive company, that this government would be well aware of the potential for conflict of interest.